The first thing you have to understand about Dravenhold is that it doesn't welcome people. It never has. The city sits at the edge of the Ashenvale forest like something that grew there by accident, all black iron fences and towers that claw at the sky, and streets so narrow the gas lamps barely push the dark back far enough to see your own feet. The cobblestones are wet even when it hasn't rained. The fog rolls in from the forest every evening at exactly the same time, like it punches a clock. Locals call it the breath of the old ones, which is one of those regional sayings that sounds poetic until you've actually lived here long enough to understand it's not metaphor. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand what kind of place this was before the girl showed up. Before everything changed. Before I personally witnessed something that I still can't fully explain to anyone without them looking at me like I've lost my mind. My name is Ilara Voss. I worked gate security at the eastern perimeter of the Dravenhold Civic Center for 6 years. Night shift, obviously. That's the only shift they run out there. And in 6 years, I had seen a lot of things at that gate. Tourists who'd read too many folklore blogs and showed up with garlic braids around their necks. Researchers from the Collaborative Institute trying to gain access to the restricted archival vaults. The occasional lost traveler who'd made a wrong turn off the highway and couldn't explain how they'd ended up in a city that technically doesn't appear on most modern maps. But I had never, not once, seen a small child standing alone at the eastern gate at past 11 on a Tuesday night in November. Not until Myra. I don't know what made me look up when I did. I was at my station, which is a reinforced booth about 12 feet from the main gate, and I was doing what I usually did at that hour, filling out my shift report, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, listening to the ambient hum of the security grid that runs along the perimeter fence. It's a low electrical pulse, almost below hearing, but after 6 years you feel it more than hear it. It becomes part of your internal rhythm. And then the rhythm changed. Not dramatically, not like a siren or a warning tone, just a small disruption. Like when you're sitting in a quiet room and someone outside shifts their weight on a floorboard. Your brain registers it before your conscious mind catches up. I looked up. She was standing about 3 feet from the gate on the outside, which meant she'd come from the direction of the forest road, the one that runs alongside the Ashenvale for about 4 kilometers before it connects to anything resembling a main road. She was small, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She was wearing a yellow raincoat that was several sizes too big for her, the kind with cartoon ducks printed along the hem, and one of the rubber boots on her feet was red and the other was dark blue, like she'd grabbed them in a hurry from different pairs. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing that got me. Kids that age, alone at night in a strange place, they cry. They stand and they scream and they look around wildly and they cry. This one wasn't doing any of that. She was just standing there, very still, looking at the gate with an expression on her face that I can only describe as determined. Like she decided exactly where she was going and had come all this way specifically to get here. I was on my feet before I'd made any conscious decision to stand up. You don't really think in those moments. Something in your body just moves. I came around the booth and walked to the gate and I crouched down because I've learned over the years that getting to eye level is important with frightened kids, even ones who don't look frightened yet. "Hey," I said, "hey, sweetheart. What are you doing out here?" She looked at me with these dark eyes, very dark, almost black in the lamplight, and she said, in a completely calm, clear voice, "I need to speak to the king." I stared at her. "The which king, honey?" "The one who lives here," she said. "I need to speak to him, it's important." I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see parents rushing up the road behind her. Nobody, just fog and the sound of the forest and the distant whine of the perimeter grid. "Okay," I said carefully, "what's your name?" She thought about that for a second like it was a more complicated question than I was making it sound. Myra, she said. My name is Myra. Myra, okay. Myra, are you here with your mom or your dad? Is there someone who brought you here? And that was the first moment she showed anything other than that determined calm. Just for a second, just a flicker, something moved across her face. Something that looked like it was working very hard to hold itself together. That's why I need to talk to the king, she said, because I can't find my mom. I radioed it in immediately. Protocol for a minor at the gate is to contact the Civic Watch first, then the residential coordinator. Then, if the child appears to be in distress or in danger, escalate to senior administration. I did all of that. What I got back was static on the first channel, a hold message on the second, and on the third, which is the administrative frequency, I got Davin's voice. Davin is the senior administrative liaison. He's been working for the Dravenhold civic structure since before I was born, and he speaks with this particular quality of careful pronunciation that always makes me feel like I'm being gently managed by a very old and patient teacher. I heard the first two, he said before I could explain. Minor at the eastern gate. I'm looking at the security feed now. She came in off the forest road, I told him. Alone. She's asking to speak to. I hesitated, because even after 6 years I wasn't always sure how to phrase things in official channels. She's asking to speak to senior administration. A pause, a long one. How old? Davin asked. 6, maybe 7. Another pause. Keep her comfortable. Don't bring her inside the perimeter yet. I'll be there in 8 minutes. Davin, I started. 8 minutes, he said. Don't let her leave. He clicked off. I looked down at Myra, who was looking back at me with that patient, steady gaze. Someone's coming, I told her. Can you tell me more about your mom? When did you last see her? Myra looked at the forest road behind her, then back at me. We were in the woods, she said. We walk there sometimes at night because Mom says the nighttime air is better for thinking. She said this with a small frown, like she'd heard it enough times to recite it but wasn't entirely sure she agreed with the reasoning. And then I turned around and she wasn't there anymore. How long ago was that? Myra thought about it. A long time. I walked for a long time to get here. I did some rough mental math. The forest road is 4 kilometers. A child's walking pace at night, alone, that's at least an hour, possibly longer. She'd been alone in the Ashenvale for over an hour. Something cold, that had nothing to do with the November air, moved through me. Myra, I said, are you hurt? Did anything happen to you in the woods? No, she said simply. I kept walking. I could see the lights. She nodded toward the gas lamps along the Civic Center's outer wall. Mom always says when you're lost, go toward the lights. That sentence did something strange to my chest. I didn't have words for it then, and I still don't entirely. Smart mom, I managed. Yes, Myra agreed, with a seriousness that was almost heartbreaking. That's why I need to find her. Davin arrived in 6 minutes, not 8. He came in one of the Civic Center's black cars, the kind with heavily tinted windows and no visible plate numbers, and he was already climbing out before the driver had fully stopped. Davin is a tall man, very thin, with white hair he keeps pulled back and a way of moving that always reminds me of a bird, very precise, nothing wasted. He wore a long coat and carried nothing in his hands, which for Davin was unusual. He always has documents. He came directly to the gate and crouched down exactly the way I had, and he looked at Myra with an expression on his face that I couldn't read. Good evening, he said. Good evening, Myra said. My name is Davin, I work here. I know, Myra said. You're the one who talks to people before they talk to him. Davin went very still. What makes you say that? Mom told me, she said. She said if I ever got into trouble and needed help, I could come here and ask for the king, and someone like you would come first to make sure I wasn't dangerous." Davin looked at me. I looked at him. "Your mother told you to come here specifically?" he asked, very carefully. "If I ever needed help," Myra repeated. "She said he would help. She said he was—" She paused and looked up like she was trying to remember the exact words. "She said he was bound by something old, something that means he can't say no to a child asking for help." She looked at Davin again. "Is that true?" Davin was quiet for so long, I started to feel uncomfortable. "Yes," he said finally, "that's true." Myra nodded like she'd expected that answer. "Then I need to talk to him, because I can't find my mom." Davin stood up slowly and turned to me, and spoke in a voice that was very controlled. "Open the gate," he said, "and call senior administration. Tell them it's a binding request." I had worked at that gate for 6 years. I had never heard those two words spoken together before. I opened the gate. They took Myra inside the Civic Center's main hall while I stayed at my post, which meant I only heard parts of what happened next through radio traffic, and later, through Davin himself, who is not a gossip, but who occasionally tells me things I probably shouldn't know because I think he understands that I would lose my mind otherwise. The Civic Center's main hall is a place I've been inside exactly 3 times in 6 years. The word that comes to mind is proportional, but that's not quite right. It's not that everything is large. It's that everything is exactly as large as it would need to be if the people who used it were not ordinary people. The ceilings are high. The spaces between things feel deliberate. The light is low and comes from sources you can't quite identify, which gives everything a slightly dreamlike quality, like a theater that's been built to look like real life, but hasn't fully committed. They brought Myra to a room off the main hall, a smaller room, which I imagine felt slightly less overwhelming, and they gave her warm things to drink and a blanket and sat with her while Davin went to deliver the message. Myra waited with a patience that apparently unsettled everyone who saw her. Civic staff aren't usually people who get unsettled easily, but there's something about a small child sitting alone in a blanket in a room designed for centuries-old negotiations, sipping whatever warm drink they'd managed to find, looking calm enough to have done this 100 times before. I'm told it had a particular effect on the atmosphere. I'm told Davin was gone for exactly 12 minutes. I'm told that when he came back, he wasn't alone. I need to tell you something about what I know of King Valdris Cain, because most of what circulates about him is either romanticized beyond usefulness or so stripped of detail as to be functionally meaningless. He is old. Ancient is the word that gets used, though I've never been entirely clear on the specific number, and the people who would know don't volunteer it. He rules Dravenhold not in the way a mayor rules a city or a CEO runs a company. It's something older and more absolute than that, something that was in place long before those kinds of human administrative structures existed. He is referred to as the king, and there is no last name in common usage, though Cain is the one that appears in the historical texts, and so it's what most of us have settled on. He is not seen often. That's the thing that is most consistently true about him. He governs through a system of intermediaries, Davin being the most visible, and direct interaction with him is rare enough that most of the civic staff have never been in the same room. I personally had seen him twice, both times at a distance, both times in ways that I processed afterward as, something is different about that person, without being able to fully articulate what. He is not what you picture when you picture a vampire king. He doesn't wear a cape. He doesn't have dramatic facial hair. He doesn't sweep dramatically through rooms. From what I have seen and what Davin has told me over the years, he has a quality of absolute stillness about him, the kind that only comes from having been still for a very long time. He moves when there is a reason to move and speaks when there is a reason to speak, and the rest of the time he simply exists, with a completeness that most living things never quite achieve. He had not come out of the inner sanctum to meet someone at another person's request in longer than Davin could precisely remember. When the message was that a child had invoked the binding, he came in 11 minutes. Myra looked up when the door opened. This is Davin's account, which he gave to me in pieces over the following weeks, and I've tried to reconstruct it as faithfully as I can. The king came into the room and he stopped a few feet from the door, not because anything stopped him, but because he stopped himself. Deliberately, Davin said, the way you stop when you don't want to overwhelm someone who might be startled. Myra looked at him. He looked at her. Hello, she said. Hello, he said. Are you the king? I am. She nodded slowly, looking him over with the particular thoroughness of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is considered rude. You look different than I thought you would, she said. Most people find that, he said. What were you expecting? Myra thought about it. Mom never said exactly. She just said you were very old and very powerful and that you kept promises. Something shifted in his expression, barely. The kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. Your mother knows me, he said. It was not a question. She said she used to live here, Myra said. A long time ago, before I was born. She paused. Before I existed, she said, which is a different thing. He was quiet for a moment. Davin said the silence had a particular quality to it, like a held breath, though no one in the room was breathing in any conventional sense. What is your mother's name? He asked. Myra told him. And according to Davin, what happened next was that King Valdris Kane, who had not hurried through a room in longer than most structures in Dravenhold had been standing, turned and walked back toward the door at a pace that required Davin to physically jog to keep up with him. Where are you going? Davin asked. The forest, Kane said. You're going yourself. She came to me herself, Kane said. That should answer your question. The night guard can coordinate a search. The night guard, Kane said, without stopping, without turning, is not going into the Ashenvale at midnight to look for her. I am. Davin said he stopped following at the main hall because there are certain decisions that don't benefit from company, and he has worked for Valdris Kane long enough to know which ones those are. I saw him come through the eastern gate myself. I was back at my station when the doors to the Civic Center's main hall opened, and someone walked out at a pace that wasn't running, but was covering distance in a way that running usually manages. I had my hand on the gate release before I'd consciously registered that I needed to open it. He came through without slowing down. He looked at me once, just a second, just a glance, and I don't know how to describe it except to say that it was the kind of look that communicates more than most conversations manage. It said, "She is safe inside, she is being looked after, I am handling the rest of this." Then he was past me, and moving down the forest road, and the fog closed behind him like a curtain. I stood at my gate for a long moment. Then I went back inside my booth, and I did not fill out my shift report for the rest of the night, because I couldn't make my hands hold the pen properly. Part 2. What the Forest Keeps. The Ashenvale is not a place that people go at night voluntarily. I've lived near it for 6 years, and I have still never been in further than the first row of trees, and only then in daylight, and only when the perimeter grid required a physical check that couldn't be done from the booth side. There is something about the forest that resists company. I don't mean that in a mystical way, though the mystical interpretation isn't entirely wrong. I mean it in the sense that when you stand at its edge, something in your animal brain sends a very clear signal that says, "This is not your space." The trees in the Ashenvale are old. Not old in the way that trees in parks are old, where old means impressive and picturesque and worth a photo. Old in the way that means this existed before the vocabulary for describing it existed. The trunks are black at their bases, whether from centuries of damp or from something else. No one has ever been able to agree. The canopy is so dense that even in November, with most of the leaves gone, the light doesn't penetrate from above in any useful way. You move through the Ashenvale at night entirely by the light you carry, and whatever faint luminescence comes off the moss on the northern-facing bark. This is what Valdres Kane walked into at 20 minutes past midnight on a Tuesday in November. What happened in there, I can only tell you the parts I have pieced together, from what Kane himself said afterward, which was not much, from what Myra told me over the following days, which was more, from what the forest gave up in the way of evidence, which was strange and sparse and open to interpretation. He moved through the Ashenvale the way someone moves through a place they know in their sleep. This is important context. The forest is old, but he is older. The Ashenvale that exists now is not the same forest that was there when Valdres Kane first walked through it, but enough of the bones of it remain that he could navigate by something older than memory, by the particular quality of the air between certain trees, by the way sound moved or didn't move in specific clearings, by landmarks that hadn't been landmarks long enough for any map to record them. He was looking for a woman named Cira Vane. He had not spoken that name in years. He had not, if you pressed him, stopped thinking it for very long. There is a particular category of person who occupies that space in a very old mind. Someone who left a mark not because they tried to, but because they were simply and fundamentally themselves, and themselves was something that took hold in a way you didn't notice until you tried to think around it and found you couldn't. Cira Vane had lived in Dravenhold for 3 years, over a decade ago. She had come as a researcher, the collaborative institute type, the kind who showed up with credentials and genuine curiosity and none of the garlic braids, and she had done her research and she had been careful and respectful and professional. And then, against what he imagined was her better judgment, she had also been something else. She had left eventually. People always do. He had let her because the alternative was something he didn't permit himself. What he had not known, what no one had apparently known, since his information networks were extensive but not omniscient, was that she had come back. Not to the city, to the forest, with a small daughter who wore mismatched boots and a yellow raincoat with cartoon ducks along the hem. He moved deeper into the Ashenvale and he thought about what it meant that she had told her daughter to come to him, that she had told the child there was a binding, that she had apparently described his particular promise, the one he'd made in a different era, in a different context, to a different set of circumstances, accurately enough that Myra had been able to invoke it correctly. You don't tell a child about something like that unless you want the child to have it as a resource. You don't do that unless you're worried you might not be the resource yourself, someday. He moved faster. The first sign that something had happened was the light. There are no artificial light sources in the Ashenvale. There never have been, for various reasons, the most practical of which is that the civic administration has never successfully maintained them. Something about the forest seems to resist infrastructure, in the same way it resists casual company. But Kane knew the forest's natural light sources. The moss, occasional bioluminescent fungi that grew on certain fallen trunks, the very faint phosphorescence that appeared on the surface of the small creek that ran through the eastern section. What he saw from about 50 meters away was different from any of those. A soft, unsteady glow, yellow-white with a quality that suggested flame. He came toward it and found the source. A small lantern, the kind you can buy at any camping supply store, sitting on a flat section of rock near the base of a black-trunked ash tree. The lantern was still burning. It had plenty of fuel left. There was no one near it. He stopped and he looked and he listened, and this is something else about Valdres Kane that I want you to understand. When he listens, he is actually listening. Not in the way people usually mean, which is hearing with perhaps partial attention. Listening in a way that processes not just sound but the shape of its absence, the pattern of what should be audible at a given moment, and what isn't, The interruptions in the ambient noise of the Ashenvale that indicated something had moved through recently and left a wake of disturbed silence behind it. He heard the creak. He heard the wind. He heard some distance off, an owl doing what owls do. And under all of that, faint and shallow but present, breathing. Sierra Vane was 37 years old. I know this because I looked her up afterward, in the Civic Center's visitor records from a decade ago, and Davin filled in what the records didn't cover. I had never met her before that night, so I can only construct her from the account that Kane gave in careful pieces, and what Myra has told me and the photograph in the visitor record, which shows a woman with dark eyes, Myra's eyes exactly, and an expression that suggests someone who is paying very close attention to something just outside the frame. She was lying at the base of a large fallen tree about 30 meters from the lantern, on her side, her back against the bark. She was conscious but barely, which Kane determined the moment he was close enough to properly assess her. Her coat was torn along the left shoulder in a way that suggested a fall. There was blood along her hairline from a cut above her ear, dried and dark, which meant it had happened at least an hour ago. Her breathing was shallow but even. She had apparently slipped on the creek bank in the dark while Myra was some distance ahead on the path, fallen down the slope and struck her head on a root. She had been conscious enough to drag herself to the drier ground near the fallen tree, which was the correct survival instinct. She had not been conscious enough to call out. Myra had turned around and found the lantern without its owner. Myra, who had been told what to do, had done exactly that. He crouched next to her. He said her name once quietly, and she responded, not with words, not quite, but with a shift in her breathing and then a turning of her head, very slow and effortful, toward the sound of his voice. She opened her eyes. He said later that she looked at him for about 4 seconds without any expression on her face other than the particular blankness of someone whose brain is still catching up with the information their eyes are providing. And then something came into her face that he didn't try to describe to me, but from the way he didn't try to describe it, I could infer enough. "You came yourself," she said, or something like it. Her voice was damaged from the cold and from not being used for however long she'd been lying there. "She invoked the binding," he said. A pause. "I taught her that." "I know, it was good of you." She closed her eyes again for a moment. "Is she?" "She's inside, she's safe. She found the gate on her own." Sierra was quiet for a moment, and Kane said later that he could see her doing the calculation. The distance, the time, the darkness, the child who had walked 4 kilometers alone through the November night and had not been frightened enough to stop. "She's like you," he said, not quite to her, mostly to himself. Sierra's eyes opened. "She's like herself," she said. "That's the thing you used to get wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember," he said. He assessed her injuries properly. The head wound was serious but not catastrophic, nothing in the spine, no sign of deeper internal damage. And then he did what needed to be done, which was get her out of the Ashenvale, and he did this in the most direct way available, which was to carry her. I'm going to try to describe this next part carefully, because I've heard it from 2 sources, and I want to get the texture of it right. Kane carried her through the Ashenvale at a pace that covered ground without jarring her, which is a harder physical problem than it sounds, because moving quickly while keeping something stable requires a kind of moment-to-moment adjustment that is easier when you have long practice with it and harder when you don't. He moved through the forest the same way he'd entered it, by the knowledge of someone who had been there before the trees could remember. And he did it with Sierra Vane in his arms and her head against his shoulder, and the lantern that she'd left by the rock sitting cold and unattended behind them because he hadn't needed it. Sierra drifted in and out during the walk back. She was aware enough periodically to know what was happening. She asked once, in a voice still thickened by cold and injury, whether the ducks on Myra's raincoat had been a good idea. "The ducks," he said, On the coat, she picked it herself. I thought it was a bit much, but she paused, reorganizing some thought. She was so certain about it. She's a child who is certain about things, Kane said. I noticed. It's a good quality. Extremely. Sierra was quiet for a while. Then, I wasn't sure you'd come out yourself. The binding. I know what the binding says. I also know you have people who could have handled it. A pause. But I was hoping. He didn't answer that, not in words. But Davin, who was standing at the edge of the forest road when they emerged from the tree line at approximately 1:15 in the morning, told me later that the way Kane was holding her when he came out of the Ashenvale was not the way someone holds a stranger they've agreed to help. It was the way you hold something you'd been carrying in your chest for a decade and had finally been given back. I was at my gate when they came. I had spent the last hour and a half in a state that I can only describe as professional alert with an undercurrent of barely managed anxiety, which is a state I've spent a lot of my career in, but rarely with this level of personal stakes attached to it. I had gone in twice to check on Myra. The first time she was eating something, some kind of emergency ration that our medical kit keeps on hand, and she was asking one of the civic staff questions about the building that I could hear from the doorway. How old is it? Who built it? What is that symbol on the wall over there? The second time she had fallen asleep sitting up, wrapped in her blanket, and one of the staff had eased her down onto a couch without waking her, and the image of her lying there in the yellow raincoat with one red boot and one blue boot sticking out from under the blanket was something that hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. I was standing at my booth when Davin radioed. One word, coming. And then they were there. Kane came through the forest tree line with Sierra Vane in his arms, and the fog parted around him in a way that I didn't fully believe until I watched it actually happen, and had to revise my understanding of what was possible. He was moving quickly and steadily, and he looked at me the way he'd looked at me going out, that communicating glance, and I had the gate open before he reached it. He came through, and Davin fell into step beside him, and they went directly into the civic center, and I stood at my open gate in the November fog for a long moment, and then I went back to my booth, and I sat down. My hands were still doing the thing where they didn't want to hold a pen. That was fine. I sat with them in my lap, and I looked at the fog and I didn't write anything. Part 3. What morning looks like here. Sierra Vane spent 3 days in the Civic Center's medical facility. The head wound was stitched and monitored. She had mild hypothermia from the hours in the forest. Nothing that time and warmth and the particular attentions of Dravenhold's medical staff, who are, in various ways, more than qualified for most situations, couldn't address. Myra spent those 3 days in a suite of rooms that were hastily reconfigured to be appropriate for a child, which I was told was an interesting process to watch since no one currently on the civic staff had direct experience with what appropriate for a child meant in a practical sense. They sent someone to a store in the nearest town. They brought back things like extra blankets and drawing paper, and some books with pictures, and a stuffed animal that Myra accepted with polite uncertainty, and then immediately named Gerald. I came in on my off-shift hours more than I probably should have. Davin stopped making comments about it after the second day, which I interpreted as tacit acceptance. Myra and I got to know each other in the particular way that children and adults sometimes do, not through any structured effort, but through proximity and small exchanges that accumulate into something. She asked me a lot of questions about my job. I asked her a lot of questions about whatever she was drawing, which was almost always the forest, in these very spare black crayon sketches that had a strange maturity to them. Trees and paths and the space between things. Once, a figure carrying another figure, rendered in about 12 lines total, but immediately and unmistakably recognizable. "Did you see them come back?" she asked me, not looking up from the drawing. "I did," I said. "Was Mom okay?" She was a bit hurt, but okay. Myra nodded, still drawing. I was scared, she said in a very matter-of-fact tone, in the woods, when I turned around and she wasn't there. She added a line to the drawing, reconsidered, added another. But Mom says being scared doesn't mean you have to stop. Your mom sounds smart, I said. She is, Myra agreed. So is he. The king. Yes, a pause. He came and talked to me this morning. I hadn't known that. Did he? He sat on the floor because the chairs here are big, she said. He sat on the floor next to me and we talked about the forest. She looked up at me. He knows all the trees. He knows which ones are older than which other ones. He knows what everything used to be called before people called it by the names they use now. She looked down at her drawing again. I told him about the route I walked to get here. He said I found the right path. He said most people can't find that path even when they know it's there. That's a good thing, I said. He said it takes a certain kind of person, Myra said. She put down the black crayon and looked at the drawing. I didn't know if that meant me, but I think he meant me. I think he did too, I said. She picked up the drawing and looked at it critically. I'm going to give it to him, she announced, when Mom is better. Sierra was allowed visitors on the second day. I was not one of them. My relationship to this situation was professionally ambiguous at best, but Davin was, and he told me about it in the way he occasionally tells me things, which is with great economy of words that leaves enough gaps for me to ask questions. Kane came in the late morning. Sierra was sitting up by then, the stitches above her ear partially hidden by her hair. The hypothermia receded to a tiredness that sat around her eyes but not much further. They talked for a long time, Davin said. He was not in the room. He gave them the room, which is something Davin does not do casually, and which communicates more about the situation than any briefing document would. What they talked about, I don't know entirely. I have some of it from Sierra herself, later, after she'd recovered enough to be comfortable sharing it, and she told me in the selective way that people tell things when they're protecting the most important parts but want to give you enough to understand. She had come back to the region 6 months ago, not to Dravenhold specifically, to a cottage about 12 kilometers from the city edge, past the forest road, in the kind of rural area that barely shows up on anything. She had reasons, she said. Some of them were practical. She was working on something, writing something, a project that had brought her back to primary sources, and the primary sources were here. Some of them were less practical. She didn't elaborate on those. She and Myra had been walking in the forest because she walked in the forest sometimes in the evenings, carefully, on routes she'd mapped and knew well. The bank where she'd fallen was one she'd never had a problem with before. One of those things. One of those entirely ordinary moments where something goes wrong and it could happen to anyone, and it did happen to her. And the only reason it mattered differently was that Myra was there, and Myra had known what to do. She told you about the binding, Kane had said. I wanted her to have something, Sierra said. Something specific, something she could hold. You could have told me you were back. A pause. I wasn't sure you'd want to know. He was very still for a moment. Sierra, he said, I have thought about what I said when you left for 10 years. I know what you said. What I said, he continued, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed something for a very long time and is only now sure they have the right words, was that it would be better for you if you went and built a life that could hold more than I could give you. That was true. I believed it when I said it. A pause. I also knew, even then, that true things are not always the things that matter most. Sierra was quiet for a moment. She's mine, she said finally, not defensive, just clear. She's fully mine and she has her own story. I know. I'm not looking for, she paused. I don't want you to feel. Sierra, very quietly. She walked 4 kilometers through the Ashenvale alone in the dark and invoked a promise made 300 years ago and stood at my gate until someone listened to her. Whatever she is, she's entirely yours. and she came to me as though she already knew exactly who I was. A pause. She asked a lot of questions about you, Sierra admitted. I may have talked about you, a certain amount. How much? A certain amount. He was quiet for a moment. She's going to give me a drawing, he said. She told me this morning. She tells everyone that, and then she actually does it, Sierra said. I have 47 drawings from her. They are everywhere. There is one on the ceiling in my kitchen, and I still don't know how she got it up there. He said nothing. Are you? She started. I'm not going to say what I was going to say when I came in here, he said, because you'll tell me it's too fast or too much or not the right moment, and you'll be right about all of that. Then what are you going to say? That I'm glad you're alive, he said, that the binding was never really a promise I made to a principal. It was a promise I made to the idea that there might someday be a reason to keep it that mattered this much, and that I'm glad Myra knew to come here. A pause. That's all. Sierra looked at him. Davin wasn't in the room, so what she said next and what happened after are things I only know in outline, through the particular texture of what she looked like when I saw her the following morning, which was the look of someone who had been through a hard night and a long conversation, and had come out the other side of both in better condition than she'd gone in. On the third day, Myra gave Kane the drawing. I was there for this part. Not in any official capacity, I was just in the hallway when it happened, which was in the corridor outside Sierra's room, because Myra had decided it needed to happen there, and Myra's decisions about where and when things happened were, I had come to understand, not really up for negotiation. She had rolled the drawing up and tied it with a piece of ribbon that she'd found somewhere. Don't ask me where. The child found things, and she presented it to him with both hands, very formally, the way children are sometimes more formal than adults in important moments. He took it with both hands. He looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. It's the woods, she said, but the version where you're carrying Mom, because I didn't see that part but I wanted to. He looked at the drawing. He didn't unroll it. He held it in both hands and was quiet for a moment. Myra, he said, when you were in the forest alone, were you frightened? She considered this. Yes, she said. But you kept going. You have to keep going, she said, with the absolute pragmatism of a 7-year-old who has already absorbed this as fundamental. Being scared doesn't mean you have to stop. Mom says that. And also, she paused. Also, I knew where I was going. That makes it easier, when you know where you're going. He nodded slowly. He held the rolled drawing against his chest the way you hold something you're going to be careful with. It does, he agreed. It makes it much easier. They stayed in Dravenhold for 2 weeks. Not in the Civic Center. After Sierra was well enough to be mobile, they moved to one of the small residential apartments that the city maintains for long-term guests, and she worked and Myra explored, and the city, in its very particular way, made adjustments. Small ones, practical ones. The kind that an ancient city makes when it is accommodating someone it intends to have around for longer than 2 weeks, even if no one has said that out loud yet. I saw them most evenings, because my shift ends around the time that most of the city is just beginning, and the eastern gate opens to the residential district, and the path they walked most evenings went past it. Myra always waved. Sometimes she stopped to tell me something she'd found interesting about Dravenhold that day, which was always specific and observed in a way that made me feel briefly like I'd been living here for 6 years, without actually looking at anything. I saw Kane with them twice, both times in the evenings, walking in the residential district, which is a thing he apparently did rarely enough that Davin mentioned it to me as though he felt I should know. He walked with Sierra and Myra in the way that someone walks with people they are being careful around, which is to say with slightly more space and slightly more attention than feels entirely natural, like someone learning a new kind of proximity. Myra, who had no interest in adjusting to anyone else's comfort level, walked next to him and talked about whatever she was thinking about, And he listened in the way I'd come to understand he listened. Completely. Without the partial attention that most adults give to children. Which meant that Myra spoke to him differently than she spoke to most adults, with more weight behind the things she said, as though she knew the words were actually landing somewhere. The second time I saw them, Myra was holding his hand. Not in a deliberate way. In the offhand way children sometimes reach for a hand when they're walking and thinking about something else, because the hand is there, and taking it is natural. She was talking about something. I caught the words bioluminescent, and also I think and also but why. And she was holding his hand and he was listening, and Sierra was walking slightly ahead, and the gas lamps were doing their thing with the fog, and it was so entirely a scene of something that I had to look at my booth wall for a moment to remember where I was. The night before they left for the cottage, which I was told was a temporary return, not a permanent departure, and which I was told by Davin in the tone he uses when he wants me to understand something without stating it directly. Sierra came to the gate alone. It was late, my shift was ending. She came and leaned on the gate and we talked for about 20 minutes, which was the longest continuous conversation we'd had, and the first one where she talked about herself rather than about Myra or the logistics of recovery. She talked about the project she'd been working on. A book, she said, about the Ashenvale, specifically about the relationship between the forest and the city that borders it, the way the boundary between them had shifted over centuries, the things the forest had kept and the things it had given back. She'd been working on it for 3 years. The primary sources she needed were here, in the restricted archive, which Kane had now given her unrestricted access to. She talked about Myra some. About what it was like to raise a child who observed everything, and was afraid of almost nothing, and asked questions that you needed a moment to answer properly. She didn't talk directly about Kane, but she talked around him the way you talk around something that is very present in your thinking even when you're discussing other things. She mentioned him in passing, in context, and each time there was a quality to the mention that I recognized from the outside as the quality of someone being very careful with something they are only just allowing themselves to have. She was right to come here, she said, eventually, toward the end. It wasn't really directed at me, more at the gate or the fog or something she'd been working through. I taught her to come here if she needed help. I wasn't completely sure she'd be able to do it, or that it would, she paused, that it would land the way it did. It landed the way it did, I said. She looked at me. Yes, she said, it did. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been trying to figure out what it means that the first person she went to when she needed help was him, rather than, she paused. I mean, she didn't know any of the people in this city. She knew his name and what he was and the fact that there was a promise. That's what she had. And she walked 4 kilometers through the Ashenvale at midnight with it. Because you told her the promise was real, I said. Sierra looked at me again, differently this time. I told her it was real, she said, because I believed it was. And I believed it was because, she stopped, because I've always believed the things that are true about him, even when they were inconvenient to believe. She straightened up from the gate. I'm sorry, this is probably more than you needed. No, I said, this is exactly as much as I needed. She looked at me with those dark eyes, Myra's eyes, I'd realized by now, or rather Myra's were hers, and she almost smiled. Davin told me you've worked this gate for 6 years, she said. Yes. He also told me you're the person who opened it when Myra came. I am. I'm glad it was you, she said, simply. I'm glad it was someone who was going to see her as, she paused, choosing the word. As someone worth opening the gate for. I didn't have an answer to that was going to work in a sentence, so I just nodded. She said good night and walked back toward the residential district, and I stood at my gate and watched her go until the fog took her, and then I stood there a while longer, and then I went back into my booth. Part 4, The Binding and What It Means. I should tell you what the binding actually is. I should have explained it earlier, but I was working up to it, and I think by now you have enough of the story to understand it properly. The binding is old. Older than the Civic Center, older than the city as it currently exists, older than most of the agreements that govern the relationship between the Dravenhold administration and the populations that live in and around it. It dates to a period that the historical record calls the Compact Era, which is a name given by later scholars and not particularly descriptive of the actual texture of what that era was, which was a period of renegotiation between different kinds of power, different kinds of people, and the question of how they were going to share the territory that the Ashenvale bordered. The binding was not the most significant agreement made during the Compact Era. It was, in fact, one of the smaller ones, a single clause in a much longer document, attached almost as an afterthought to the primary territorial agreements. It said, in the language of the time, that children who come seeking refuge or assistance shall not be turned away by any authority that holds dominion over this territory, and that said authority will respond personally and with full priority to any such request made in genuine need. The binding was not made because children were commonly in need of rescue at the city's gates. It was made because the Compact Era had produced a generation of displacement and uncertainty, and there were people, many people, whose children were at risk, and one of the things that could be traded for in those negotiations was the safety of the most vulnerable. Valdris Kane had signed the binding personally. His signature is in the archive. Sierra told me she's seen it in the original document. His handwriting is different from any modern script, older than the letter forms we currently use, but legible enough that she could read it. He had kept it for over 300 years. Every child who had come to the gates of Dravenhold in genuine need in all that time had been received. The record is in the archive too, Sierra said. Hundreds of entries across centuries. Most of them are names and brief notes. Some of them have follow-up documentation, where the child went, what happened, what the outcome was. None of them, as far as the archive shows, involved the king coming out himself. Not until Myra. I asked Davin about that, about why it was different. He thought about the question for a while. We were having coffee in my booth, which is a thing we occasionally do when the city is quiet and there's no particular administrative crisis, and we both happen to be around at the same time. He drinks his with nothing in it. I drink mine with too much sugar, which he has never once commented on, which is one of the reasons I trust him. He could have sent the night guard, Davin said finally. He could have sent the medical team. He could have sent me. But he didn't. No, he looked at his coffee. When I delivered the message, when I told him the child's name and what she'd said, he was already standing up before I finished the sentence. He was already moving. A pause. I've seen him make quick decisions before. I've seen him act decisively under pressure. That's not unusual. He looked at me. What was unusual was that he didn't ask any of the questions he always asks. He always asks, what's the situation, what's the risk, what's the recommended approach? He always gathers information before he moves. But not this time. This time, Davin said, he heard the name of the child's mother, and he was moving before he'd finished hearing it. He looked at his coffee again. There's a phrase in the old texts from the Compact Era. They used to say, some bindings are old enough to become true. They start as agreements and they become reality. They start as promises and they become what is. What has always been, even when it wasn't yet. He was quiet for a moment. I think for him the binding is something like that. It stopped being an obligation he honored and became something he simply was, a long time ago. I thought about that. And when Myra invoked it, I said slowly, it wasn't a call on an old promise. It was more like, Davin considered the word, a recognition of something that was already true. He picked up his coffee. In my experience, those are the moments that move him, not commands, not obligations. Recognition. We sat with that for a while. She gave him a drawing, I said. He has it on the wall, Davin said. In the study, he had it framed. I looked at him. By the next morning, he added mildly. Myra left with Sira on a Wednesday morning, back to the cottage through the forest road, and this time in daylight with a vehicle, and with the full awareness of everyone at the civic center that they were going, and when they expected to be back. I was on my shift when they came through the eastern gate. Sira had her research bag and her laptop case, and a careful walk that showed she was still managing the aftermath of the fall. And Myra had Gerald the stuffed animal in one arm and was wearing, for reasons never explained, a scarf that was clearly several hundred years old and had clearly been given to her by someone from the Civic Center's wardrobe in response to a specific request, because there was no way she'd found it on her own, and the civic staff, I'd noticed, had a hard time saying no to her. Myra stopped at my booth. We're going back to the cottage, she told me. I know, I said. Are you coming back? She looked at me like this was a strange question. Of course, she said. Mom has to finish her book, and I want to see more of the archive. And she paused and looked back at the civic center, then at me. I told him we'd be back before the first snow. He said the snow in Dravenhold is different from snow anywhere else. It is, I confirmed. It comes in from the forest. It has a particular color. What color? Kind of blue, I said. Very faint, but you can see it if you know to look. Myra filed this away with the same systematic care she applied to everything. I want to see that, she said. Then you'll have to come back before it happens. She nodded firmly. We will. She adjusted Gerald in her arm. Then she looked at me with those dark, considering eyes. Alara, she said, you're the one who opened the gate. I am. That mattered, she said. Very plainly, in the way she said things that were important without any additional ornamentation. You didn't make me wait outside. You crouched down. You looked at me like I was worth talking to. She paused. That mattered. I looked at her. You're welcome, I managed. Myra. She gave me one short, satisfied nod, the kind that indicated a completed transaction, a piece of necessary business properly concluded, and then turned and walked to where her mother was waiting, and Sira looked at me over her daughter's head, and there was something in that look that I didn't try to interpret, just received. They went through the gate, and I watched them go up the forest road until the first bend took them from view, and I stood there for a minute in the November light, actual daylight, pale and honest, nothing like the gas lamps, and I thought about all of it. The first snow came 3 weeks later. I was at my shift, obviously. It started around 9 in the evening, which is late for the first snow but consistent with a mild autumn, and it came in from the direction of the Ashenvale just as it always does, and in the dark the particular color of it is more visible than in any light, and what it looks like, if you've never seen it, is white the way starlight is white, with a blue undertone that you catch at the edge of your vision more than straight on. A blue that belongs to the forest and comes in with the snow and sits in it as it falls. I saw headlights on the forest road at 9:40. The black car pulled up, the door opened. Myra got out first, with Gerald and the scarf, and she looked at the sky for a moment, and then she turned to the gate and she caught sight of me, and she lifted her arm in a wave that used her whole body, the way children wave when they are genuinely pleased to see you. Sira got out behind her. She looked at the snow and then at the gate and then at me and smiled. I opened the gate. Myra came through, and she stopped just inside and held her arm out and let a snowflake land on her sleeve, and she peered at it. It is blue, she said. I told you, I said. She looked up at the falling snow, and she was very still for a moment. And she was 7 years old and wearing a yellow raincoat and mismatched boots, and holding a stuffed animal named Gerald, and she was standing in the snow that came from the oldest forest in the region, in a city that didn't appear on most modern maps, in a place that kept promises made 300 years ago, and she looked at all of it with the absolute certainty of someone who has come somewhere she was always going to end up. "Okay," she said. "Just that, okay. Like, yes, this is what I expected. This is correct. This is how it was supposed to go." She walked past me toward the Civic Center, and Sierra followed her, and I watched them both go through the courtyard and toward the doors where someone, Davin, I realized, in his long coat with his precise bird movements, was already coming to meet them. The snow kept falling, blue-white in from the forest. I stood at my gate.